Recently, I've been thinking about how designing games based on their final price can affect them. For free-to-play or live service games, the answer is easy. They're designed with monetization in mind from the ground up. No element is put on the table without thinking about how it might drive future customers to the cash shop. But for premium games, it isn't so simple. I had a singular question on my mind. How could a publisher ethically justify charging $80 for a game? Like, if I were Nintendo and I wanted to ethically justify charging $80 for Mario Kart World, what would I have to change about it? This question led me down a rabbit hole until I reached the following conclusion. Art has no price. There was no change I could possibly make that would be able to justify the raise in price. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, in order to answer that question properly, we will have to start with the basics. So, let me ask you a question. What is art? Here's a couple of definitions from a few of the major dictionaries. I want you to see if you can tell a pattern between them. The Oxford Dictionary says it's the expression or application of human creative skill and imagination, typically in a visual form, such as painting or sculpture, producing works to be appreciated primarily for their beauty or emotional power. Merriam-Webster says it's the conscious use of skill and a creative imagination, especially in the production of aesthetic objects. The Cambridge Dictionary says it's the making of objects, music, and images that are beautiful or express feelings. The thing is that all these definitions, except for one, are in some way qualitative, referring to some form of skill required on the part of the artist, meaning that it will ultimately be up to the eye of the beholder whether or not something is art. If we were to take these definitions to their logical extreme, it would mean that one cannot actually create art, only view it. Art is not art until it is viewed to have skill, beauty, or some emotional truth behind it, which is why no one can seemingly agree on what is art. However, personally, I like to define it in a more objective manner, as I don't think someone's intention to make art should be up to the audience. Whether or not that art does anything for them is, yes, ultimately subjective, but the intention which it was made from should not be. This leaves the final definition from Cambridge up to debate, and it is almost perfect, but it's missing one crucial element: intent. I think art, defined simply, is human expression created with intent. Intent, in this sense, is important. As I said earlier, I do not think it's useful for us to consider art as a purely qualitative label from the audience when it comes to creation. Therefore, the author of the piece must itself have intent so it can have meaning beyond the one the eye of the beholder imbues it with. Now, why did I even bring this up? Just to brag about my personal definition? Not necessarily, because the subject of the video requires us to clearly define what is art versus what is a product. It helps us distance ourselves purely from the subjectivity of art and helps us clearly qualify what should fall under it as human expression made with intent, and that which helps build on it being anything that aids that expression. Products are a bit different. A product is a thing that is built to perform a task or a function. It has no expression or intent apparent necessarily. As long as it performs the duty for which it is made, it is successful as a product. This is where things get a bit sticky. Art on its own cannot perform a function the same way every time, in the eye of the beholder. So anything that aids the product in furthering that expression does not directly correlate with any increased aptitude to perform that function. Some people will never get it or find that particular expression useful or enlightening. This is part of why the commodification of art is such a complicated topic. In our modern world, we see the various artistic industries often not referred to as such, but instead as the entertainment industry. This is to help us slot art more cleanly into the role as a product, something that can be bought and sold. After all, the goals of entertainment can be more clearly defined. You're selling leisure, distraction, and ultimately a waste of time to the audience. As long as the free hours are suitably filled, the goal of entertainment is done. What the audience ends up taking away from the entertainment is ultimately superficial to the seller. The only thing that truly matters is that they come back to continue engaging with and purchasing your product during their free hours. To the seller, they're not selling art, they're selling entertainment and engagement. Because ultimately, it's hard to give value to art. The goals of a product and of art are not always one and the same. Indeed, the battle between what would increase its value as a product and what would clarify its message as art informs much of our modern media landscape. But as much as we would prefer to pursue art for its own sake, one needs money to survive. And so, if you wish to treat art as anything more than a hobby, you will need to figure out a way to sell it somehow. And so you must sell your art as an entertainment product, because there's no quantifiable way to price someone's expression. Art has no price, but your time does. And when time is the ultimate metric by which all prices are decided, how does that affect the design of a product? In quite a few ways. As an example, let's talk about the recent rise of open world games. Now, the reasons for the rise of the genre are multitudinous and varied. Some of it comes down to the popularity of games like GTA, or the inherent joys of exploration. But another reason is its inherent ease for advertisement as a product. There are many objective metrics you could cite for your open world that make for good back-of-the-box selling points, whether that be its gargantuan size or the amount of hours you could theoretically get out of trying to do everything in it. Open worlds are fairly easy to post higher playtimes for, as it's easy to copy and paste activities all over the world in different locations and get away with it. But those excessive lengths don't necessarily have to be a point against the game either, as the stuff is usually optional. The value of these large lengths comes from the idea of dollars per hour, i.e. these games offer a lot of bang for your buck. $60 for 200 hours of entertainment versus 12 hours seems like a pretty cut and dry value proposition from a marketing perspective. Another tactic used in pitching games as a product is visual fidelity. Unique or interesting art styles are hard to quantify for a marketing executive, but the fact that your game looks 2% closer to film can be objectively witnessed and put easily on the back of a box. Matching that with an open world helps quantify the value of your large world in more objective terms. Lastly, probably one of the largest reasons for the genre's continued proliferation is the use of focus groups in order to ascertain what people will buy. These focus-tested, known formulas are often married to known intellectual properties that have previously seen success. By using the success of previous entries in this brand, they are able to roughly calculate the audience for the new product. With the use of focus-tested, proven formulas and known brands, they're more easily able to objectively quantify the potential profit of the game as a product. A lot of marketing and selling a video game comes from grappling onto these few quote-unquote objective metrics. Now, you'll notice that not a single one of those metrics has anything to do with the artistic qualities of the work. Instead, they latch onto the few objectively quantifiable elements they have and try to pitch them as selling points. Because everything else, especially in the early phases of a game when the concept is being pitched, is subjective. You can't sell to a publisher your interesting story idea. They can't quantify the success of that. You can't sell to a publisher your beautifully unique art style. They can't quantify the success of that. You can't sell to a publisher the importance of your message. They can't quantify the success of that. You can't sell to the publisher the uniqueness of your central game mechanic. They can't quantify the success of that. Publishers and investors are not interested in selling art. They're interested in selling products, because selling art is an inherent risk with no quantifiable audience or price. Historically, art has never been an institution aligned with monetary success. Many of the most famous painters died penniless. Indeed, the pursuit of material gain in art is often viewed as tainting the work. But, as we mentioned earlier, in our modern world, the ability to pursue art for its own sake and not for material gain is an idealistic fantasy that simply is not possible. If you wish to pursue art full-time and still have something to eat, you will need to sell it to continue to survive. All entertainment is a compromise between art and product. So what happens when we emphasize and focus on the price of art in critique? You get a lens that focuses on how efficiently art can waste your time. Art, history, culture, and expression are not wastes of time and never have been. They are touchstones of the human experience and important to who we are as a species. They are how we share our lived experiences with one another, and learn from them. They are how we share the history of this world, so we do not repeat our mistakes and capitalize on our victories. But none of this is necessarily important to the goal of a product focused on engagement. The content could be footage of a literal, actual garbage fire for all the executives care. All that matters is that the content is in some way engaging and makes you more likely to come by next time. The value of the content as art and the amount of engagement it creates is not necessarily correlated, as content only needs to be sufficiently distracting and absorbing to be good content. The easiest and most profitable content is always the most efficient waste of time. A perspective that emphasizes price necessarily emphasizes elements that create perceived value in a product. Evaluating art by its perceived value is evaluating it as a waste of time, as none of the elements that make it art contribute to that perceived value. Now let me demonstrate this point. We're going to go over various principles we talked about that contribute to the perceived value and show the effects they actually create when concentrated on. We're going to start with graphics and weave in other principles as we go along. What about graphics? Surely the pursuit of better technology and more realistic visuals is a legitimate artistic endeavor worth chasing. While it's true that research and development in order to discover better technologies is a neutral good for the industry, the implementation of these technologies is not always strictly necessary in the here and now, especially when they're very new and very expensive to make use of. The fact of the matter is, even if you do prefer realistic art styles, the cost to make and create games that are about 3% better looking than the realistic games that came before is getting ridiculously expensive, and the diminishing returns are becoming greater as the years pass. And the reason this is being chased, regardless of the massive expenses, is simply because the improvement is objective. A compelling, interesting art style like Okami cannot be quantifiably sold in the same way a 3% increase in realistic-looking graphics can. For a marketing team, unique art styles like Okami's are a nightmare, as a potentially interesting art style has the chance to turn people off as much as it has to appeal to some. This is why marketing value homogeneity so much in animation. Ask yourself a question: why do you think so much animation looks highly similar when appealing to certain markets? It's market research and predictability. Like I mentioned earlier, when selling a product, an executive wants to see objective metrics, something that can be measured, calculated, and pitched to investors as a sure thing. It doesn't matter if your game might be better suited with a different art style. If it's up to the suit, it will look like every other one on the market, because at least then they have an idea of exactly how it will be received and the kind of money it can make. All the better if it's realistic, as objective improvements in getting closer to realism is something they can pitch even easier. And when it comes to market research, you would think it would result in giving people what they actually want. But the truth is, people don't know what they want. They only know it when you give it to them. So when you ask them prior to that experience, they can only tell you what they've already experienced. So all they'll say is to give them more of the thing they already like. Market research usually exacerbates homogenization and stagnation for this reason. Lastly, we must consider the worth of measuring art as entertainment by the length of time it takes to consume it, as it is an exercise in bloat. And that's kind of the point. We talk about bloat like it's a bad thing, but for a company, it's not. Because from a product point of view, bloat is ultimately an extension of the product. As we said before, the easiest and most profitable content is the most efficient waste of time. A product point of view sees the content thereof as neutral, and anything that creates engagement as a positive, and anything that decreases it as a negative. From this perspective, more is more, and the more there is, the more engagement that is possible. And the more engagement by the consumer, the more chances there will be for them to spend money on microtransactions. This is how we got something like Assassin's Creed Valhalla. The reception to its bloated length was so bad that the subsequent campaigns, like in Assassin's Creed Shadows, have been halved in length. So obviously, length for its own sake isn't a metric worth chasing, but it's one we're tempted to do all the same. Now let me pose a hypothetical reviewer. This is a position I've seen some hold, at least in part, on the internet, but I do not wish to call out anyone in specific, as that would be outside the character of this piece. In this hypothetical review, you can see them become largely torn between two sides. A part of them that sees Hollow Knight as being a large, fairly priced product for what it is, being frankly one of the largest Metroidvanias ever made, and only $15, and a part of them that felt as a whole, Hollow Knight wasn't reaching its potential as art. This all comes from the idea of being a consumer critic, someone who's able to advise those who are low on money on what makes for cheap, long-lasting entertainment. However, in doing so, you emphasize the entirely wrong aspects about Hollow Knight. It says that the game primarily has value because it's 35 plus hours long and has a lot of bosses to fight and places to visit versus the usual 8-ish hour length of a Metroidvania. All that for only $15. What a steal. But the only thing that says about Hollow Knight is it sure is a cost-efficient waste of your time. And while this would ultimately be a shallow view of the game, this would hardly be this supposed reviewer's fault. We've been trained to give credence and value to these product-centric metrics, but they are hardly entirely hypothetical or even on their own. You do not need to go far to find clips of reviewers angrily complaining about how something is only blank hours, as if this is the defining metric of what makes a game good at all. Is the reason why Hollow Knight is better than Metroid Dread because it's $15 and twice the length? Does Metroid Dread necessarily have to be a better game just because it costs $45 more? Should Mercury Steam have tripled its length in order to make it worth the price? Would Hollow Knight be a worse game if it cost $45 more? Now, before we continue with this train of thought any further, let's take a step back for a minute. A lot of this discussion can sound like, please leave multi-billion-dollar company alone rhetoric. The fact of the matter is that people have a finite amount of money to spend on goods, and not everyone can afford to purchase every game regardless of price. Taking the logic I'm about to lay out and using it to its extreme basically says that every game could cost $200 and that would be fine. Price is relative and it all means nothing. It spits in the idea of consumer rights and consumer protections, that we should be able to get our entertainment at affordable prices, just like we should be able to get goods at affordable prices. But I would refer to you again back to what we were discussing before. If I were to ask for a poll about what the price of Metroid Dread should objectively be, you would likely not see any kind of wide consensus form. Instead, you would see people squabbling over whether it should be $50 or $40, or heck, even $20 or $15. Then you would have people pushing back saying there's nothing wrong with a platformer costing $60, and it would circle around and round with no end in sight. And every justification for why it needs to be blank price bracket would draw back to one of the principles we've talked about today. And if we apply these principles as feedback to the publisher, how do they go about making the next 2D Metroid more worth the $60? Make it unnecessarily expensive to develop by upping the graphics a ton? Metroid is already niche. Making the graphics excessively fancier would just slim down the already not great profit margins for the franchise. Then we take its tight pacing and completely smash it with a sledgehammer by making it 3 times as long? Great, now that we've made it unsustainably expensive and poorly paced, is it finally worth the $60? And what about the upcoming release of Metroid Prime 4? Does its existence make Dread inherently of less worth? Does a 2D game even have the right to be in the same price bracket as a 3D one? So, would it have been worth $60 if they simply made it 3D Metroid instead and changed nothing else? And what does that say about the worth of 2D Metroid? And on another note, is the problem with $80 games that Mario Kart was the flag bearer? Would it have been more okay if GTA 6 was at $80 to $100? I saw a lot of people far more comfortable with the idea of GTA setting the standard. After all, it hits all those juicy product checkmarks for value. It only makes sense for it to be an expensive product. In all of this, have I ever brought up the quality of the games in question as art? No, because it's irrelevant. Games aren't priced as art, they're priced as products. But as we said before, art has no price, and we need to survive, and not everyone has infinite money. So what really is the point of all this? For me to stick up my pinky finger and gloat over the peasants that don't appreciate true art? To say that not being able to afford whatever you want sounds like a you problem, and even complaining about it is bad? To defend big corporations in charging whatever arbitrary price they deem fit, because it's all subjective anyways? does the commercialization of art really mean we must view art as a product first? Is there any way to reconcile this problem? Let's run through a thought experiment. We're going to try to figure out how to make ethical profit in a capitalist system. What are the basics of all commerce? Supply and demand, and while the supply of digital games is technically infinite, we can more accurately graph the price of supplying the game to the development cost of it, especially in this modern era. The ethical price for a game likely exists somewhere between how much it costs to develop it and how many people are willing to buy it. Let's take Falcom for example. All their games are $60, but unlike most $60 games, they look for all the world like PS2 games. However, teams within Falcom are generally small, and their development budgets are relatively humble compared to the bulk of current AAA studios. Honestly, Falcom is more AA than they were ever AAA. The thing is, the budget for Falcom games is still relatively high for how niche they are. The fact of the matter is Falcom isn't really all that popular, so even if their games are made on a relatively humble budget, it makes sense for them to be $60 regardless because the market cap for a Falcom game is remarkably low. You could say the same thing about Atlas. Metaphor ReFantazio was made on a remarkably lower budget than Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. While the prices are the same, the audience for them widely differs, with the audience for Final Fantasy being much bigger, which is how Square justifies these absurd development costs. Though it should be noted that Square was disappointed with the performance of Final Fantasy VII Rebirth on PlayStation 5, so obviously they expected more than they got. But not everything can be cleanly summarized using audience size alone like this, and even then, this is an oversimplification of the situation these games are in. Perhaps we should consider some of the other factors we've covered. So let's look at some indie games. We can take the example of something like Journey. It cost $15 on release and is around only 3 hours long, a length that is sometimes controversial, but its length reflects the experience the developers wanted to give. It's matched by an art style that is incredibly detailed and vibrant. The game aims to be visually arresting to look at. Void Stranger, on the other hand, is $12 and takes roughly 60 hours to beat. It is pretty long for a game, but it reflects as well the experience the developers wanted to give. But unlike Journey, it has a lower fidelity art style very intentionally similar to that of a Game Boy game. These games couldn't be any more different, and while I have absolutely no clue how the developers decided the prices they landed on, I can say it would make literally 0 sense for Void Stranger to be 20 times more expensive than Journey because it's roughly 20 times longer. And if we were to bring up graphics, while Journeys are about 20 times more complex than Void Stranger's Game Boy aesthetic, it similarly would make no sense for it to be 20 times more expensive. But indie games can be the wild west of pricing. There's often little rhyme or reason to the precise price point chosen. I mean, why is Void Stranger $12 instead of $15 like Hollow Knight? Like, why make it $3 less? Seems kinda random. Most of the circumstances around them are fairly similar, with them being made by smaller teams of people on a humble budget, with simplistic art styles and long gameplay times. Is there any way we could codify this that would make any sense? Why it needed to be exactly $3 less? Like, what were the development budget differences between Hollow Knight and Void Stranger? Would it even matter? If anything, Hollow Knight's should be lower considering Team Cherry had Kickstarter money to work with. That System Erasure never did. It's more likely though that they just charged what they thought most people would be willing to pay for it. System Erasure is likely going for a lower price point because, well, it's a niche puzzle game. Whereas Hollow Knight is a Metroidvania, which is a very popular genre in indie circles at the moment. Keep in mind that Hollow Knight is one of the cheaper Metroidvanias in its bracket. Even games that take a lot of inspiration from it, like Ender Mongolia, charge $25 for their game. Why would Ender Mongolia be $25 when Hollow Knight is $15? Is that Hollow Knight charging below the usual price in order to undercut its competition? Or is that Ender Mongolia being greedy by charging more than it? Keep in mind, this price is still more expensive than even Hollow Knight's sequel, Silksong, which is only $20. But the price is still not wildly out of step and is in a fairly expected amount. For example, another game that's inspired by Hollow Knight, Nine Souls, is $30. If we were to try to make an objective calculation of what is ethical to charge, what would that even look like? Let's start with some equations. You'll be able to see them on the screen. So the first one is audience times the cost minus the platform and other fees of your game. Then you take the complete number and minus it by the budget of the game, which should give you profit. With this calculation, we can roughly tell how much profit we would make. But how do we make it solve for cost? We'll try profit plus budget, and then that complete number would be divided by the audience, and then that whole number would be added to the fees, which should give us the cost of the game overall. But in order to solve for that, we would need to know what an ethical amount of profit is. And if we were to find this hypothetical ethical profit amount, would any company actually follow it? Well, if we put the principles of capitalism into consideration, they kind of already are. Ethical profit under capitalism is the maximum amount possible and preferably more next time. Following the system as it's meant to be makes the equation only equal to infinity, and preferably infinity plus next time. Such is the nature of infinite growth. You will eventually need to go to infinity and beyond. Therefore, any consideration of ethical profit must exist somewhere outside the concerns of capitalism. Elsewise, your price will always eventually become unethical as you chase the principles of capitalism. This means that, no matter how hard we push them, large corporations especially will always be driven towards unethical profit. Now, ethical profit, considered outside the system of capitalism, could simply be just how much you need to live comfortably. Under this logic, attempting to assign any specific or fixed number to it ignores the needs of different people who live in different territories, countries, states, and cities. It also ignores the idea that a lot of people have different standards for the type of life they want to / need to live. At the end of the day, the question is a highly individual and personal one, even one that's likely to change over time and day to day as life does. So considering this, is the $25 price of Ender Mongolia agreed over Hollow Knight? I don't know. But I don't think it would necessarily be agreed with this logic. My understanding is that Ender Lilies and Mongolia combined still sold less copies than Hollow Knight did. So when they went about making a sequel to Ender Lilies, they likely considered their potential sales cap when deciding the exact price should be around $25. This would make it so they only make what they need, hypothetically. But this doesn't make qualifying it or justifying it any easier for the person buying it. At the end of the day, the only thing they can do is trust that the developer is only charging what they need. It also puts the onus on the developer to only sell what they thought they would, or else all the excess profit will render the price they charged unethical. Indeed, if we had a hard amount they are allowed to make and need to make, how does that affect pricing when they sell too much? Do they need to start giving away the game for free? If they sell too little, is it justified to raise the price? And if we were to make assumptions that say, well, making more than you projected isn't a bad thing, and what matters is that you're charging ethically within your expectations, wouldn't that just make pessimists the true winners of our system? Doesn't it seem even a little bit ridiculous that your own personal confidence in the performance of your product should have any consequence on how ethical your price is? Well, how else would we conceive it? Even as ridiculous as it sounds, there's not really a better way of considering it. It's simple math. If you need a certain amount of money, and in order to earn that money, you make a product to sell for a certain amount of money, if you were to ethically reach this amount of money, you would have to charge however much it takes for you to get that money by the amount of people that are likely to buy it. Then how do we rectify the fact that this is kind of ridiculous? Well, you respect what it is. You can't make it an exact equation. To do so would necessitate knowledge you cannot have, mainly the exact amount you're going to sell, and the exact amount you need to live comfortably. Indeed, as I said earlier, what you need to live comfortably can change day to day and over time. You never know when you might find yourself in a situation where you might need more money than you thought you ever did. There's simply no exact way of calculating ethical profit while eliminating bad actors. On some level, you must simply trust people to charge what they think they need or deserve in order to keep the lights on. But as we said earlier, this requires an absurd amount of trust on the customer end, so this framework for pricing is simply untenable. So in the end, are we just left with the old model of charging the amount you think customers will pay for? Perhaps we should look into AAA for some different answers? Well, AAA can be just as weird as indies. Find me a person that can explain why Metroid Dread, Ys X, and Baldur's Gate 3 should all objectively be $60 using the metrics of time, graphics, or genre convention, and I will find you a man that's not sane. All of these are from considerably niche genres: CRPG, JRPG, and a 2D platformer. The time to beat between them is also insanely different. Metroid is 8 hours, EZEX is around 30 hours. Baldur's Gate 3 can easily reach above the 100-hour mark. All three look very different. Metroid has a 2.5D art style that's gorgeous on its own. EZEX is a Falcom game and therefore looks like it belongs on the PlayStation 2 or 3, but it has a clean anime art style regardless. Baldur's Gate 3 is more traditionally realistic than either of them, and even has fancy cutscenes, but the bulk of the game does come from a top-down perspective, as is expected of the CRPG genre. You might well say, that just makes it so Baldur's Gate 3 is the only one among them that deserves to be $60. I would point out that the bulk of CRPGs don't actually cost that as a standard. It's breaking convention for pricing in its genre, much like Metroid was. The real reason it's more expensive than most is it was more expensive to develop Baldur's Gate 3 than anything else in its genre, as it has far more cinematic flair than anything before it. When you marry that cinematic flair to the expansive lengths expected of a CRPG, you get a game that was hardly cheap to develop. EZEX costs as much as it does because, as we mentioned earlier, Falcom is incredibly niche. They would never be able to sell enough copies to get away with charging a lower price. We can also see similar behavior with Square Enix. It takes a lot less money to develop Octopath Traveler than it does Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, but they have the same price, because one reaches a larger audience, and the strategy here is to sell higher prices to a smaller audience, rather than attempting to sell at a lower price, hoping to attract new audiences. Although it's hardly a cut and dry thing, the upcoming Octopath Traveler 0 costs $50 for some reason. I don't know if this is a mission of smaller scope or a change in strategy, but it's interesting nonetheless. Metroid Dread is more of a brand value play than anything else. Part of me believes Nintendo charges $60 for their 2D games not out of a desire to make it rain money as much as they dislike the idea of devaluing the perception of their brands so much that even though Metroid would probably make a higher amount of profit at a lower price tag due to increased sales, they choose to keep it at a higher price anyways for the prestige of their brand. All these explanations I just gave you, do they feel like a crock of shit to you? Because I lied to you. Baldur's Gate 3 is only $60 on PC. It's actually $70 on PlayStation 5. A worse version of the game. Now you could give any number of excuses for this. That's just Larian adapting to the market on PlayStation since $70 is the standard now there. You could also say it's just Larian passing the price of porting the game to another platform, similar to the justification I used for Falcom's $60 price, as CRPGs aren't that popular on the platform, therefore the audience for the port could be small. There's a reason the C tends to stand for computer or classic. On that note, should it become $80 when it's ported to Switch 2? I mean, Mario Kart is $80, surely Baldur's Gate 3 should be $80 as well. In fact, why not $90? It's obviously more content packed, right? In fact, the problem with GTA 6 maybe costing $100 is that it doesn't cost enough. We all know that GTA costs the entire GDP of a small country to develop. It deserves more. Why not $120? Just at base, that's before any microtransactions, which are definitely there. That's double the price of what games used to cost, but GTA hits all the metrics people want, so you'll get the value all the same, right? Now anyone that wants to compete with GTA should match that price, as anything less means you're lesser than GTA. But that's not enough. We want to justify charging higher prices. So let's raise our budgets, make ourselves longer, extend our tails, and be a live service. By upping the ambition of our game to the price of 2 countries' GDP, perhaps we can charge $600 and tell people to get another job. Obviously, it'll be worth it for GTA 7. This one looks like you're driving an actual car from real life, and the game is thousands of hours of content. In real life, your car would cost quite a bit more than that, and there's so much more you can do with it in GTA than you ever did with that car. So really, it's a steal of a deal. Are you getting value for your dollar now? Did the chasing of higher playtimes and better graphics lower the price of your games at all? Is your entertainment any more affordable? Are you getting a better deal? So when you look at Metroid Dread and say this shouldn't be $60, what should you actually be asking for? Why is it a problem that Mario Kart 8 is $80? Would changing the game in any meaningful way make it justifiably $80? If so, what would have given them the right to charge $120 or $600, and do we even want that? I know what I want. I want games that respect my time, with worse graphics, made by smaller teams, and I'm not kidding. Why on earth would I want that? Simple. The alternative causes enshittification. I want a healthy, sustainable game industry making quality art. The endless chasing of high-fidelity gaming, more engaging gaming, more popular gaming will only lead to higher prices, bloating of game lengths, alongside greater homogenization of genres as the companies toting these ever-ballooning budgets are only willing to make the safest bets possible. The problem with Mario Kart 8 costing $80 isn't that the campaign isn't 100 hours and the world doesn't look like a perfect recreation of Los Angeles. The problem is that it took 9 years for them to get around to making it, and Nintendo didn't develop it in such a way that it was sustainable enough that they felt they could charge $70 for it like they are for Donkey Kong Bonanza. That the looming threat of higher game development costs scared Nintendo enough that they felt the need to normalize $80 as a price tag despite the backlash they undoubtedly knew they would receive. By giving a price to art, we are slowly destroying it. However, even considering that art has no price, that doesn't mean price should have no upper limit. In this, we can use accessibility as our guide, with the goal of making art accessible to as many people as possible in a sustainable way. When I brought up earlier the example of GTA 7 costing $600 in some future date, what was the primary concern with that? Well, it was developed in a way that made it so the creators needed to charge $600 to make a decent profit. So even if the price was hypothetically fair considering their budget, the price is still incredibly inaccessible to their target demographic. In fact, I chose this specific price point very intentionally, as a callback to something Sony did back in the day. They told people to get a second job if they truly couldn't afford the $600 price tag of the PS3. Does this attitude show concern or recognition of accessibility to their existing audience? Regardless of whether or not that's what they needed to charge, the price they asked for was simply way too expensive for the majority of their customers. Similarly, we can look at the normalization of $80 as a price tag as an accessibility issue, one that would behoove creators to examine their development practices and develop games more sustainably so they can justify charging prices more in line with what people can actually afford. So is this our solution to art not having a price? One that AAA might even accept? But I don't think these companies see any problem with how they currently price things, nor how they provide value to their customers. The truth is, marketing executives and suits are all a bunch of fools that are wearing blindfolds, probing a beast they don't understand and have never seen. Each one of these clowns runs their hand alongside its form and don't know if they grabbed an eye or a roll of fat, so they guess at the contours of the beast, estimating its size in order to sell it to the highest bidder. They tell their shareholders that this beast will be the largest yet, paying no mind to the cost to shelter such a monster. The research they've done says the beast is quite popular with certain crowds, so even with the little knowledge they have on hand, they choose to take a risk on it anyways. Even with the risk being known, they assure their shareholders that the bet they made is the safest they could. The beast is already popular. Thousands of hours have already been spent playing with it, so they don't need to understand the first thing about it in order to make it sell. And so the blind lead the blind until those that do see start to value what the blind see as if the blind ever could. Those that know the beast don't value its size nor the theoretical amount of time they've spent with it. They value its perspective, its heart, its innovative spirit, the joy they felt when they spent time with it. But it's hard to sell something so human. Not that the blind could see it anyways. So they sold not but its form to the masses as a waste of time. The people pricing most of the world's art are those interested in pricing it as a product. They have no interest in it as art. They are only selling what they themselves view as a waste of time. And if you view games as art, as something other than a waste of time in totality, why would you put value behind the metrics put forward by such artless hacks? When you tell people with such a vapid view of art that the metrics they value are what you look for, you'll only get back what they think of it. A waste of time. Because when you chase value in games, you chase the values of those that assigned it. Art has no price, and we need to stop pretending it does. Or else, at the end of the road, we'll just end up with the same vapid wastes of time they wanted to sell to us anyways. That doesn't mean you're not allowed to charge for it, nor that your customers are not allowed to complain about that price. After all, there's nothing wrong with wanting your media to be priced affordably as to be accessible to as many people as possible. Just that you shouldn't let the price tag define your game or any other. Because even if that price is extremely fair, all that says about your game is it sure was an efficient waste of time. And that's the end of the video. Thank you so much for watching and sticking all the way through to the end. If you like it, please make sure to like, subscribe, and share it with others, as well as leaving a comment. I read all of them, and I would love to hear your thoughts. Also, you should see a few videos up in the corner. Feel free to watch any of them that strike your interest. Anyways, I hope you have a great day and take care. Bye!